rarity of self-control. You look around at our world, you do not see a world filled with self-control. You see a world that's filled with people who will indulge themselves on whatever the flavor of the day is. Nietzsche, who lived about a century ago, said that he who cannot control himself will be controlled. And we see that in our commercials. When you and I watch commercials on television, watch commercials on social media, you see where our base appetites are being advertised to. Maybe it's food. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's pleasure of one sense or another. Advertising knows that they can break down self-control, and that is a way to get money out of your pocket. That is a way to get time out of your day. That is a way for them to be successful. In Titus chapter 1 and verse 12, Paul, notice he sent Timothy, the young preacher, to Ephesus, which had an eldership, which was established. He sent Titus, an older man, to a church that didn't have elders yet, and to a church which, they had some issues. Look there at Titus chapter 1 and verse 12. There Paul describes the Cretans. He says one of their own prophets, their own people, have described the people of that day as liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons. Now, that's a description of today's society, isn't it? Lying. Do you see people, politicians, who lie? Do you see people in our culture who lie? Absolutely. Do you see evil beasts? People who are created and run by their animal nature? Absolutely. Do you see lazy gluttons? People who always take and never give? That's our culture today. And it's a culture that lacks self-control. That's the society we live in. It's societal ills. Proverbs chapter 25, verse 28, whoever is unable to take over his own house is like a city without walls. He'll be vulnerable to whatever faces against him, and he'll be without hope. Notice if we quickly look through Scripture, what happens to men with no self-control? These are the spiritual giants we're about to look at. Samson, the strongest man that God has ever created. In Judges 14 and verse 2, lost self-control and desired a woman who did not love the Lord. And when his parents said, "Can't you find someone else?" he said, "No, get her for me. That is who I want." He did not control himself, and that led to the downfall of that great spiritual man. We read about David, 2 Samuel chapter 11 and verse 2. A great king of God, a man who had a heart after God's, and yet he lacked self-control. That caused him to commit adultery, that caused him to lie, that caused him to murder, and caused his family to absolutely be destroyed because he could not control himself. 1 Kings 11, 1 through 4, we see Solomon, the wisest man who's ever lived upon this earth, lost self-control. He married many women who did not love God, and in his later days, they took him away from his service to God. These people lost everything because of a lack of self-control. It's rare. And if you can control your heart, if you can control your mind, if you can control your spirit, you will be one of 100. You will be a very rare person in this world, and you will be successful. Because a vast majority of people today don't control themselves or can't control themselves. Now, why is that? The first lens we looked at was the rarity of self-control. Now we're going to look at the difficulty. Why it is so hard for us to control ourselves. The difficulty which is there. Why? It's our natural appetite. We always want more. There's always more for us to get. In Isaiah chapter 56, verse 11, Isaiah describing the people of his day, of how they were turning away from God and chasing after idols, chasing after the things of this world, chasing after everything but godliness. He says these people are no more than greedy dogs. They never have enough. They're shepherds who don't understand. They look only to their own way. Everyone for his own gain, everyone looking for his own territory. How many marriages today fall apart because a husband or a wife, instead of being committed to their spouse, decide that they want more. How many people are in debt? Serious debt. Because they're buying not things that they need, not things that they have to survive. They just want to buy more. How many people find themselves far away from God because they've decided to serve themselves, and because of that, they've wanted more? They hurt themselves. They destroy themselves. People crave fleshly pleasure. Paul describes this, Philippians chapter 3, beginning of verse 18, where he says, "Many walk, of whom I've told you often, they walk as enemies of the cross. Their end is destruction." Notice this next phrase. "Their God is their belly. Their glory is their shame, because their mind is only on earthly things." That phrase right there. Their God is their belly. Now, that's not just referring to the physical digestive system. That's referring to a desire to consume. And how many people are controlled by a desire to consume that leads them away from God and leads them away from what God has called us to be? There's a difficulty which comes in remaining focused. How many of us are distracted? How many of us are confused by whatever it is that's going on in this world? It's interesting, several years back when we first started live streaming and doing our things online, we had trouble sometimes because our bandwidth during services would just shrink because it's so hard to stay off your phone during worship. It just seems impossible for us to go more than 5 minutes without checking to see what everybody else is saying, even though they may not be saying anything new. It's so hard for us to get 8 hours of sleep. It's so hard for us to operate at school and at work because we're so easily distracted by social media. We're so easily distracted by the news of the day. Sometimes it's politics. We're so easily distracted by everything going on, and by having a piece of our heart and our mind spread in so many different places, we can never focus on what really matters. We can never focus on what really is important. Paul tells Timothy, 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 4, "No one who is in the army, no one engaged in warfare, entangles himself with the affairs of this life. He wants to please them who enlisted him as a soldier." Imagine, many of our number have been engaged in the military and have served honorably. Imagine if you told your drill sergeant, "Hey, I'll come, but first I got to check my social media." Imagine how that would turn out. Imagine if you're in the military and you receive an order and you say, "Well, yes, officer, I realize I need to obey that order, but, I've got other things going on. I'll get around to it eventually." Well, we're in the Lord's army. And one of the reasons why the Lord's church does not succeed and does not grow the way it should is we're entangled with the world's affairs and we are distracted. You got to have priorities. In Acts 24:25, Paul is before Felix. And if you are fighting for your life, if you are on trial and you very possibly could be killed, Paul eventually would be beheaded, and you're before the official who decides whether you live or die, what would you say? Well, hey, I didn't do it, right? You defend yourself. Paul preached a sermon because he saw not a problem, he saw an opportunity. Well, what would you preach about? Paul's sermon's very different than the sermons you and I hear today. His sermon focuses on 3 subjects: righteousness, self-control, and a judgment to come. Righteousness, self-control, and a judgment to come. Every sermon needs to focus on Jesus. But if you are to succeed as a Christian, if you are to be what God has called you to be, if you are to be right with God, righteousness, self-control, and preparing for the judgment to come. Those are such important things. The third lens, the first was the rarity of self-control, the difficulty of self-control. Now the necessity. It's needed, the necessity of self-control. You cannot be a Christian if you cannot control yourself. You cannot be what God has called you to be unless you're learning and practicing self-control. We read in the Bible there's things we must avoid. 1 John chapter 2, beginning of verse 15, do not love the world or the things of this world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. If you fall for those things, you are not right with God. This world is passing away, as well as all those who follow after such things. Lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, pride of life. Every one of those revolve around self-control. There are some things Christians should not do. There are some things Christians must not do. And if you're to be what God has called you to be, you've got to stay away from those things. You've got to have the mental acuity, the strength to stay away from the things of this world. But it's more than just action, it's desire. You and I have to train ourselves what to love. You have to train yourself to be attracted to that which is good and to be repelled by that which is evil. And I joke sometimes about this. When I was a child, I hated broccoli. Now, well, hate's not the right word. I can eat it, especially if you cover it with that cheese, which takes away all of its nutrients. But I can eat steamed broccoli now. Why? Maybe I'm getting old. Maybe I recognize the nutrients and the importance of healthful eating. Train yourself in what you eat. Train yourself in what you see. Train yourself in what you hear. Train yourself in what you desire. 2 Peter 1, beginning in verse 4. You see the precious promises of God by which we have been given to us, exceedingly great and precious promises. And it's through those promises of God that we are made to be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in this world through its lust. For this very reason, with all diligence, add to your faith virtue, to virtue knowledge, to knowledge self-control, to self-control perseverance, to perseverance godliness, to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness love. If you have these things in you, you will not fall short of God's love. How do you teach yourself to love what you need to? You expose yourself to it. It becomes habitual, a habit that you always go to. You recognize its benefit, and you recognize how joyful it is to partake of it and to feel that success, which is there. Self-control leads to success. Paul says this, 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 25. Everyone who competes for a prize is temperate or self-controlled in all things. They do it to obtain a perishable crown. We do it to obtain an imperishable crown. Paul here is looking at the Olympics. And if you watch the Olympics when they come up every 4 years, 2 years if you count the Winter Olympics, I'm not sure skiing is an Olympic sport, but people tell me it is, and luge, all those different things which you see there. But if you watch the Olympics, you see people who have dedicated their lives to their sport. Those figure skaters, almost before they were walking, many of them were learning how to skate. Their entire life they've worked on it. Those gymnasts, especially the ladies, have spent their entire lives since they were young girls training their bodies to do the things which they're doing. They watch what they eat. They watch what they do. They watch who they're around. They watch what goes in their mind because they realize what goes in the mind goes in the body. Everything works into it. And Paul is telling us in that passage, watch those people and apply it to yourself spiritually. If you're to be what God has called you to be, you've got to control every aspect of what goes into your mind. You've got to be in charge of your life, in charge of your soul, in charge of your spirit. Well, now the last lens. And that's the acquisition of self-control. How do you get it? How do you obtain self-control? Dale Carnegie, in his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that's Stephen Covey. Dale Carnegie, it is How to Win Friends and Influence People. That's his book. And a quote which I found from there says, everyone seeks happiness, and the way to find it is to control your thoughts. Happiness depends on the inward condition and not the outward condition. In other words, what Dale Carnegie is saying is all the money in the world is not going to make you rich. All the success in the world will never make you, well, it will make you rich, won't make you happy. All the success in the world will not make you happy necessarily. What makes you happy is how you perceive. What makes you happy is how you control yourself and control your mind to recognize the blessings which God has given to you. That's why happiness is so much greater on scale in a third world country than it is here. And that is why even here you see people who may not have reached or attained the heights that other people have in society or influence or money, but they're so much happier. It's because it's a control of the inward thought and not the outward circumstances. How do you obtain self-control? First, learn to rely upon God. When you become God's slave, God's servant, as Paul and James and others so oftentimes refer to themselves as they open up a book in the Bible, when you learn to truly rely on God, you'll learn to control yourself. Because it's no longer you who's in charge, but it is God. Romans chapter 12, beginning there in verse 1, I urge you, beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you offer your bodies a living sacrifice. Don't be shaped, conformed to this world, as is the manner of some, but rather transform yourselves as you see the good, perfect will of God. Train yourself to rely on God. If your issue is with liquor, train yourself to rely on God. If your issue is watching things, listening to things that you should not watch and listen to, train yourself to rely on God. Put Him first and recognize you are first and foremost a Christian who belongs to the Lord. You're not your own. You are bought with a price. Secondly, persevere. Stay faithful. If you fail one day, get up the next. Persevere. Keep working. Keep learning. Keep doing well. I learned to enjoy the sport of cross country. Not me doing it, but watching it. I had a son who was involved in it, and from watching that, it's fascinated me. That very first meet, almost half of those kids in middle school will barely finish even a shortened race. It is tough because if you've never done it, it is hard to convince your body to operate in that way. And then you watch them at the end of the year, and they're not only running the whole race, they are running it quickly. As they get into high school, they learn strategy. And that's even more so as they get into the college level. Why? They weren't that good at the first time. But day after day after day, those habits have stacked up. Day after day after day, their bodies and more importantly, their mind has transformed. The same applies to us spiritually. When you stack one day upon the next day upon the next day, you transform who you are. When you give yourself to God and learn to be a people of love, learn to be a people of forgiveness, learn to be a people of peace, learn to be a people of dedication, learn to be a person of sacrifice, that stacks up and transforms who you are. Even in the tough times, the day when you fail, you learn that you can grow. James chapter 1, beginning in verse 2, says, My brethren, count it all joy whenever you face fears and trials of many kinds, because you know the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And that perseverance must continue and grow, that you might see the things of God and lack nothing. Number 3, you rely on God, you persevere. Number 3, fellowship. Find friends who are similar to you. Find people who encourage you to be better. Now listen to me closely. We tell our kids, marry a member of the church, and that's an important aspect. But it goes deeper than that. Don't just find a friend who goes to church. Find a friend who is committed to God. And when you put yourself around those kind of people, it transforms who you are. It makes it easier for you to be the kind of person God has called you to be. And whatever it is that you're trying to transform in your life, one of the ways to find self-control is to find friends who hold you accountable, to find friends who encourage you, to find friends who can help you through whatever issue it is that you face. Hebrews 10, 24 and 25, we quote that all the time about the come to church verse, right? But it's deeper. What the writer of Hebrews is talking about there is how we need to persevere. We need to hold fast. And the third let us, L-E-T-U-S passage there in Hebrews 10 is to put yourself around godly people. It says in that passage, consider one another in order to stir up love and good works. Don't forsake the assembling or the community of yourselves, as is the manner of some, but exhort one another, so much more as you see that day approaching. People who are dealing with substance abuse oftentimes cannot defeat that evil enemy until they associate with people who are showing them, encouraging them, helping them, and can relate to them. Those of us, and I say us, we're covered by the blood of Christ, but every one of us struggles. And we should encourage one another, help one another, love one another, relate to one another, even so much more as we see that day approaching. So if you want to be a person of self-control, rely on God, persevere, find good people, fellowship. Number 4, watch placement in your life. Pursue better things. Watch the placement in your life. I went to college about 14 hours away from where I lived. Now, I drove a little bit quick sometimes and got there in 12. Mom's not here today, so I can say that. I used to have to put everything I owned in the back of my little Toyota truck. It was a little truck. And I learned pretty quickly the science, if you will, of packing. How do you pack? You know, this goes here, that goes there. And you learn how to pack everything because there's only so much space, right? And you've got to learn how to pack it if you're going to bring everything. If you just throw it in there haphazardly, about 2/3 of it will fit, 1/3 you've just got to get rid of. So you learn where to fit each thing. Now, I know that you can relate to that. You may not admit it, but you've got a closet or a garage or a shed that's probably very similar, unless you're self-controlled enough to be organized. Then you don't have to worry about this lesson. Each one of us has 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day, approximately 30 days in a month, and 365 days in a year. You've got to learn what to fill it with and what to keep out. One of my favorite parables, and hardly anyone else ever knows it, but it's one of my favorite, is Luke 11, 24 through 26. It's the parable of the unclean spirit, and you know it. The man here says, I'm going to change. I want to be better. I'm tired of living the life I'm living. So he kicks out his evil spirit, and he cleans the house, and life is great. But the world hates a vacuum. And he leaves the house empty because it's clean. And Jesus says the spirit goes out, and he's upset because he's homeless. And he finds 7 spirits just as bad as he is. And they come right back in, and they fill that house. And his situation is worse than it was in the beginning. If you're looking to attain self-control, it's not enough to kick out the evil spirit. You've got to fill your heart, your life, and your mind with something else. It's not enough, if you want to be pleasing to God, to not be bad. You've got to be godly. And there has to be so much godliness in your heart that there's no room for the devil. But when you find yourself alone in the dark, when you find yourself away from everyone else, when you find yourself idle, that's when that demon comes back. And so it's important for us in our heart, mind, and life to make sure we fill ourselves with godliness. Don't just get rid, but attain godliness. Paul writes to Timothy, God has not given us a spirit of being timid. God has not given us a spirit to be afraid, but rather power, love, and a sound mind. As we hear this lesson tonight and as we study these scriptures and these passages, I want us to make a commitment to control ourselves. I want us to make a commitment to let our identity be chosen by ourselves rather than let our identity be given to us by the circumstances in which we find ourselves. I want us to make the decision to belong to God and not the world. Physically, mentally, and foremost, spiritually. Self-control. It's the last of the Christian fruit. It's right in the middle of the Christian graces, and it's what we are called to do. Let's be a people of self-control.